I had never thought about it before, other than, of course, trans women are women. Like, it hadn't occurred to me any of the logic behind it, because why on earth would it? I had never heard anything different.
I'm Jane.
I'm Connie Shaw.
And I'm Bex.
And this is
Insightful Sisters.
Connie, we're so lucky, glad to have you here. I love the way you're so articulate. You just seem to phrase things really well. You're a real icon, for younger women. I'd like to ask a bit about your background and find out a bit more about you. So I want to ask you first about school. What was school like?
I went to a private school in Suffolk, and for context, it was a very well-performing school. But in terms of private schools, in comparison to the rest of the country, the fees, for example, were below the average private school cost of fees. And it felt like students who were there were very aware of how lucky they were to be there. And I always feel like I try and downplay how posh it basically was. And yes, obviously, to most people, any private school would be really posh. But I find it interesting to try and convey the fact that I think there's a particular type of private school which is not so elitist that they do not even think about the way that other people might live their lives, but because there was such a mix of people at that school, and people from very different backgrounds, from extremely wealthy backgrounds to people whose parents are having to work multiple jobs to afford the fees to send them. It was kind of like a middle ground, middle class private school. And I think that a lot of private schools in that situation have what I would call middle class guilt. And in that way, I think that was the reason why my school was particularly woke. Before lockdown, I can't remember necessarily coming into contact with social justice movements other than learning about the civil rights movement at GCSE history. And I think that was the first time that I was exposed to things that have shaped the way that we talk about social justice now. And I felt so inspired by them, whether that was the women's liberation movement, or whether that was Black Americans getting the vote and their civil rights movement. I found it all very inspiring. And then just before I did my GCSE, my GCSEs were cancelled and we went into lockdown. And so I'd sort of had 2 years of learning about social justice movements which were great. People seriously did not have the same legal rights back then. And so I think when I went into lockdown, I was sort of geared up. It was almost like it was a perfect storm for me to be sucked in to the way that Black Lives Matter and other social justice movements happened over lockdown, because I just had 2 years of being really inspired by it and thinking how these people were so amazing who spent their time going to protests and really bringing about actual change. And I was like, oh my God, this is my chance. I'm part of it. It's happening again now, and I'm part of it.
So when you say the social justice things that you learnt about in history, what sort of, you're talking about the civil rights movement?
The civil rights movement in America, whether that was African Americans or if it was women or if it was LGBT. Yeah, the period from sort of the end of World War II up until the late 80s, about how African Americans were treated, how women were treated. Yes, it was all American history. I've never really thought about that before, to be honest. Looking back, I do think I was really sucked into something, and to the point where I would have the way that I felt like I had a duty to educate my family, and I would get quite angry with them at home. I remember having a discussion once about whether it was possible to be racist towards a white person. I was trying to tell my uncle that it just was not possible, because the definition of racism is that it's like a dichotomy of two different classes of people, and the oppressors are white people and the oppressed are Black people and other ethnic minorities. And so in that way, it is impossible for someone to be racist towards a white person. And I can think of various other examples where I would get extremely emotionally irate about certain issues.
That's really interesting. So you didn't have, I'm assuming, because a private school, you don't have to follow the national curriculum.
No.
And you don't get involved in things that the local authority buy in terms of training en masse. So you won't have had the training organisations that a lot of other schools will have had. So a lot of the gender ideology, you know, the stuff that we saw about lying with the Barbie at one end and the Ken at the other. You didn't have
I remember
that sort
having
of-
one PSHE lesson, I think, in either year 10 or year 11 that was delivered by the school matron, and it was about different sexualities. And I remember we were trying to define different sexualities. For example, one I remember was like demisexual, for example. I can't remember if we spoke that much about gender or whether if it was just about sexualities. I'm sure we did, and I just didn't see any difference. But I remember being aware of the fact that gender identity and sexuality was not the same. I remember once having a conversation with my nan, and she said, "Have you seen this in the news?" And she was discussing it with one of her friends, and it was about a woman who identified as a man. And she said, "But why can't she just be a lesbian?" And I said, "No, Nan, you do not understand. This woman is not a lesbian. She is a straight man." Um, and I think I enjoyed the fact that I could understand something, or I thought I understood
Yeah.
something older generations didn't understand. And that I was able to I had this sort of access to this new movement, and I had to explain it to other people who didn't understand. So I feel like young people perhaps have, it's almost a form of rebellion when you're used to having things explained to you by adults. Suddenly there's this thing that is really complex, and but young people feel like they understand, and so they're in a position where they can explain something that makes absolutely no sense to older generations.
Yeah.
And I remember that feeling.
Did you get that intersectionality wheel with the sort of various? I mean, you've probably seen that at uni, I expect, have you? Do you want to describe what it looks like?
It's like the wheel of privilege, and in the middle is privilege, and then the further out of the wheel you get, the more oppressed. So, for example, closest to the center of privilege would be white, straight men, cis men. And then, as you can imagine, it would become like white, gay men, for example, and then it would become, just to simplify it, black gay men. And then you'd have like women sort of in between all of those lines. And the most oppressed person would be, I don't know, a disabled, black, gay, working class, trans woman. However many things that you can fit on there. I don't ever remember having something like that explicitly given to us, but I do remember learning about intersexual feminism, probably first in GCSE history when we were learning about the women's movement. I think I remember hearing about it then, but I did A-level politics and we learned about feminism, and learning about bell hooks, so that explained it more to me. But I think I came across it first in GCSE feminism, GCSE history, when we learned about the way that the women's movement and African American civil rights movement were intersected, and that actually black women were affected by both. And people like bell hooks had to explain that, and that they weren't just part of one movement, they were across two.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, is a real thing.
Of course. The thing that I always notice about those, the first time I saw that wheel, I was doing a training for a charity that I was a trustee for. And the first thing I noticed was that poverty wasn't involved in it. And I just thought, well, poverty surely is the thing that makes life difficult for people. But it wasn't there at all.
Yes, and actually, when I mentioned that, as soon as I said it, I was thinking, I wonder whether class is actually on these wheels, because that is one thing that they seem to always miss out. Some of those wheels are so massive, though. I'm sure some of them do. But yeah, when it comes to intersectionality in general, I agree. It seems to be missed out a lot.
I suppose I was thinking that I wonder about the wheel, that it makes it an easy thing because it's visual, and it's presented to them and it's in an easy form. It's almost like a tick box, isn't it? You go through and you tick which of the oppressions people have. And I wonder if the actual visual thing of the wheel made this spread through younger people and really spread the idea.
Definitely. Whenever you see these graphics online, and all the things that I was sharing over lockdown, they were all beautiful, beautifully illustrated, really appealing to look at. And sometimes I do remember thinking that I was posting stuff. I guess I would agree with the message, but there would be lots of different infographics saying the same thing, but you pick the one you liked the way it looked the best. Sometimes the way that these activists would make, so someone else, like a big account, like an activist account, would make whatever post displaying a certain message, and they'd have across in one post where you could include 10 different photos, they'd have the same message printed 10 different times, but in different colours. So you could choose what colour the message appeared on your story. So it sort of went with your Instagram feed. Like, it's that level of, I mean, it's very clever. But the thing is, the people who, like you're saying, the people who that appeals to are going to be young people that aren't necessarily always thinking, what does this mean? Or do I just like the way that this looks? And I remember, well, there was this one infographic that I posted, the only one I ever posted about trans over lockdown. Despite the fact it was the only one, I definitely made sure my views were very clear. And that was the infographic of two cartoon vulvas right next to each other in their identical image. Above one, it said man/non-binary, and above the other one, it said woman. Above that, it said genitals don't define gender. And I'd written my own comment saying, if you don't agree with this, you're simply transphobic. I had never thought about it before, other than, of course, trans women are women. Like, it hadn't occurred to me, any of the logic behind it, because why on earth would it? I had never heard anything different. I remember before lockdown, I kind of see my school life in two chapters, before lockdown and after lockdown. Before lockdown, I remember there was a girl a few years above me who was trans identified, but the only thing that I really noticed was that she wore the male school uniform. And it was quite obvious because at my school, I mean, it really doesn't help with issues like this. The girls' uniform was entirely different to the boys' uniform. So the girls, you could have the option to wear trousers. I was actually part of the campaign group, or the school council, that campaigned to get trousers for girls. Up until year 9, we didn't have the option to wear trousers. We had to wear skirts, but we wore pinstriped jackets and skirts, no tie, and a white shirt or a blue shirt, depending what year you're in. And then the boys would wear a black trousers, black jacket with their shirt, and then the colour of their tie would depend on their house. And there were 6 different houses. So the boys and the girls looked entirely different. So if you were a student who was gender non-conforming, and you thought, oh, I really don't want to wear a skirt, and at that point, this girl who's a few years above me, there wouldn't have been trousers at the school. Or they would have only just come in. Like, it would have been really obvious. Like, even if the trousers had just come in, it was really obvious the girls who were wearing them didn't want to wear skirts. And so the only thing that occurred to me is, oh, this person just doesn't want to wear feminine clothes. Being trans it didn't occur to me that it was anything more than that, just sort of presenting in either being more feminine or more masculine. And then over lockdown, I think the fact that I posted that wasn't a reflection on the fact that I'd really truly thought about it. It was just that it felt like it had been shoehorned into the fact that Black Lives Matter was going absolutely mental. There were things about, Black Lives Matter just sparked off every form of social justice movement. And it just felt like I needed to make sure I posted something about everyone, even though I didn't understand it. So I would have posted things about neurodiversity as well.
Yeah. I'm sure you were not alone in that.
I definitely wasn't, but I really saw myself as sort of this leader, because when I was at school, I've always had quite a strong sense of justice. And at that time, it was quite uncool to be sat woke at school. Like, people would call, I was a snitch at school. I would tell on people for things that really weren't a big deal, like using offensive language in group chats that I thought was outrageous at the time. Looking back, it really didn't matter. But as, an 11-year-old going into a big secondary school for the first time, I hadn't seen behaviour like this, because I was in primary school. I think I was just at the end of where no one really had phones in primary school. When I was at primary school, no one really had phones, and group chats were just becoming a thing. So I didn't have social media until I got to secondary school. So I'd never seen people communicate in such a horrific way sometimes. So I'd tell on people for things like that. People would be scared to say certain things around me, and I was never afraid of saying what I thought. And so I almost felt like I had this reputation to uphold over lockdown. It's like, I'm not in school, so I can't voice my opinions to people. So I need to make sure I make it obvious online that I'm still thinking about things. And I sort of prided myself on the fact that I wasn't just reposting stuff. I was replying to other people's stories, and I would engage with other people who replied to me. I wasn't just sort of ignoring when people disagreed with me. But yeah, I felt like I had a duty to continue.
What was the moment when you suddenly thought, oh, this is all madness?
So the moment came 2 years after that. I went into sixth form after lockdown, and I was with one of my friends. We were running the Feminist Society, and so every week we'd meet up and we'd talk about something to do with feminism. It wasn't even just to do with feminism. I mean, it was extremely liberal, woke feminism, so it wasn't just focused on women. And then it was towards the end of year 13 for Pride Month. The school has a podcast of its own. And this episode is still on Spotify, but they asked me to do an interview with a trans student in my year. It was a girl who identified, I think she went as he, they, or he, him. But to me, looking back, this was a girl who didn't want to necessarily be a man. She just didn't want to be female. And it was my idea at the start of the episode. I said, should we introduce ourselves with our pronouns? And so we did that. And then we had a conversation, and the student was telling me how her life expectancy was now 30 because she was trans, and how the suicidality rates of trans people was extremely high, and basically how hard it is to be trans. But at the same time, she explains, I used to want to be presenting myself as sort of a macho man, but she said, but I actually really miss wearing makeup sometimes. And so now I've taken that pressure off myself, and I'm experimenting more with makeup. And the whole thing just seemed unnecessary. I was like, why do you have to identify something to present yourself in a certain way? Surely that just means that these are the clothes you like to wear, and this is the makeup you like to wear sometimes or not. And I remember, and at the end of that interview, I spoke to a friend afterwards at some point, and I just said, I just thought as feminists, because there's a friend who came to the Feminist Society, I thought as feminists, we were trying to move away from gender stereotypes, but this conversation sounded like this girl felt like she didn't fit in the box of being a girl. And so she feels like she has to be something else, but also misses things that are stereotypically associated with girls, like wearing makeup. And I just said, it just seems like she's trying to force herself into a different box, and surely that's not helpful. And that was the first time sort of a seed had been planted in my mind. And that was just before I finished my A-levels. And then 4 months after that, I went to uni, and gender ideology was absolutely everywhere. Whether that was seeing Pride progress flags hanging up everywhere, the fact that there were gender neutral toilets. I think at school we had disabled loos and there were gender neutral toilets, but I had never really clocked that because the seed hadn't been planted in my mind.
No.
I can't even remember if the disabled loos were labelled as gender neutral. But when I went to uni, I was like, oh, these gender neutral toilets everywhere, they're not just random, it's because of this thing. Then I remember seeing at different unis across the country, gender expression funds pop up. I remember seeing a friend from school repost something that Warwick Student Union had posted, and it was their gender expression fund. I was just looking back at my old messages with my friend Lottie, who I went to school with, who's also now sort of a public gender critical young feminist. She was in the Telegraph a few months ago. And I remember sending it to her, being like, what do you think about this? And I said, I think this seems really wrong. And I remember feeling a bit nervous telling her that I felt this way, because I was like, oh my God, what if I'm a TERF? And she ended up agreeing with me entirely. So I completely agree. It's obviously reinforcing gender stereotypes. Why should you need to buy makeup to feel like you really are a woman or something, or buy clothes to make you feel like you really are a man? And I just remember thinking, I really hope this doesn't come to Leeds, because it's clearly ridiculous. And then a few months later, it came to Leeds.
Yeah.
I was, at that point, I had started Leeds Student Radio, and I was presenting on Politics Hour. And I realised quite quickly on that when it came to politics, because my course was not just philosophy, but religion and ethics. And I was very much involved in sort of culture war stuff at school as well with the Feminist Society. I was very much more interested in the culture war, or what would be referred to as culture war issues within politics. And so I really liked listening to the BBC Radio 4 podcast called The Antisocial Podcast. And I listened to an episode that had Susan Smith on, and there was also a trans woman on, and they were debating. And I realised that I agreed with what Susan Smith was saying. And I can't remember if it was a coincidence that I had listened to that episode after realising that the Gender Expression Fund was ridiculous, or if I had seen the Gender Expression Fund, realised it was ridiculous, and then went out and was seeking people who believed in the way that I thought I might be thinking. And it turned out I had a connection. I knew someone who knew someone who knew Susan, and so we got her on LSR.
Wow.
And I realised that I agreed, and Susan and I had a long call before the interview, and even though the three of us on the show were interviewing her, I spoke to her a lot, and I just realised that all of the doubts I was having, I wasn't just being horrible. There was a reason I had noticed that this wasn't working, or this idea just doesn't make sense. And then she recommended that I go to Living Freedom, which is the Freedom of Speech Festival put on as sort of a branch of the Academy of Ideas. And I applied to that and I went. And before I went, I was looking at the speakers and I saw one name was Helen Joyce. And I realised that I had seen her name on X before. But whenever I had seen her name on X, because her profile picture is just the book that says Trans When Ideology Meets Reality, I remember seeing that for the first time thinking, oh God, she seems quite extreme. I remember thinking, I had this resistance. I'm really worried if I start looking at these extreme people, maybe that's a bit too extreme. And I need to come to my own decisions about this. But I thought, well, she's going to be at this festival, so I'm going to see her speak anyway, so I might as well watch some interviews that she's done already. And I just started watching interviews that she'd done, and I just thought, oh my God, this woman isn't extreme. She's talking with complete clarity. And I bought her book. I think I bought her book after or just before Living Freedom, but I read it afterwards. And I met Helen at Living Freedom and it was like, oh my God, yeah, it was amazing. I read her book and I was obsessed with her book over summer. And I remember reading it in my room and then coming down to my family and be like, listen to this. But I had decided as well that I wanted to do my dissertation on sex and gender. And so I spent my whole summer reading things, listening to things. It was all I did really, whatever spare time I had. And so I really was peaking. And then just at the right time, Tickle versus Gickle happened. And that was like, I understood at that point the debate. I hadn't heard of Tickle versus Gickle. I didn't know it was happening until it happened. And I saw it on Twitter. And I just thought, oh my God, this is actually, I don't know. I just couldn't believe that all of these things, I was thinking, God, this really can't take hold. And then I don't think I realised that it really had taken hold.
Yeah.
And the more I found out, I mean, I think it's natural for most people who come to this realisation, you just have no idea how this is affecting every part of your life.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
It is. I'm going to pass you across to Bex now because I think she's got some questions.
So I'd like to ask you about your experience towards the end of university. Obviously, everyone's aware that you became quite controversial in your university. In your own words, what happened there and what do you think went wrong?
Well, before I went into my third and final year at Leeds, I had spent the summer doing almost nothing else, or it felt like, looking back, at doing nothing else other than listening, watching, and reading about women's rights versus trans rights and how trans rights was a huge threat to the safety of women, children, and free speech. So once I was going back to uni, I had more than you could even possibly imagine it peaked to the point where I didn't give a toss anymore as to what people would say. I think if I started talking about this, I knew that it could go wrong, but I never imagined that my podcast would be recognized by that many people, because lots of people end up doing podcasts at uni and they end up just being very localized within the student radio and journalism community. No one really pays much attention to them. That's not because they're not good, it's just the nature of how it is at uni. So when I went back to uni, I was fulfilling my role as the daytime editor that I'd been elected to do, which meant I was overseeing the 5 talk shows, the daytime talk shows on Leeds Student Radio. And I also started my podcast on the side. And I think I did 5 episodes before I got suspended from my committee position. And the first one, I used content from the Reform UK conference, which I was very lucky to go to on a media pass. I'm not a member of Reform UK, but I knew someone involved in the party and I wanted to try and see if I could get to go to the newest political party on the block, because it was a very big moment in our political history. So I covered that and I used that content in my first episode. I did my second episode with Charlie Bentley Astor, who is a detransitional desister from gender ideology. So that was the first time that I properly spoke about it. Someone who helped me edit that episode had a complaint against him made from a separate society, and he was told he had to distance himself from me and my work. And they knew it was him because I tagged him to credit him when I advertised the podcast episode. So I had to untag him. He got told off. Then we didn't work together anymore. And I remember this feeling of being like, can we even be seen together in the office anymore in case someone, because there was a lot of overlap between I think it was the DJing society, between people in that society and the radio station. So that was upsetting because I thought that I'd be making loads of new friends when I went into LSR, because nearly all of my friends from first and second year went on year abroad or placements. So my social group had really drastically reduced because I had just stayed on to do my final year. So I thought by getting involved with student radio that I'd be able to make really good friends. And so that was the first, like, oh, can't really, it's a bit of a risk for him to be seen with me just in case someone else sees him. And then after Charlie's interview, I can't remember who was in between or if there was anyone in between, but then at the Battle of Ideas, which was soon after, I interviewed Andrew Gold, which was fine. No one really paid attention to that one. No offense to Andrew, but people didn't seem to be bothered by that. But they were bothered, or at least the Student Radio Society was bothered by my episode with Graham, and also the fact that I'd written an article for his Substack in which was titled Gender Madness at the University of Leeds. And I just wrote all of the examples to explain how much the ideology had just taken over. One of the examples was the fact that on the committee wall, the display wall in the committee room in the student radio office, the picture with my face on and my committee position had my pronouns next to my name. And I explained in the article how not only had I not been asked whether I wanted my pronouns next to my name, but I hadn't been asked what my pronouns were, which was obviously defeating the whole point. I remember, because obviously this is when I just peaked over the summer, and I was so excited to get stuck into the committee. And when I first saw the wall, and I was like, oh, my pronouns are next to my name. And I didn't say anything. I was just like, oh, what I really wanted to say to the station manager was, why didn't you ask me? Like, that is a religious symbol to me that is opposed to my own rights. And I remember just seeing it and feeling my heart sink, thinking, God, what are people going to think when I start talking about this more? And then I did talk about it, and it turns out they didn't like it very much. And so when I got the email that I was being suspended, all they said the reason was for my Substack, my social media and my media productions. They didn't specify anything. And at this point, I got in touch with the Free Speech Union as soon as I got that email through my friend Emma Hartley, and she works now for Rosie Duffield, but she was sacked by an MP over a year ago now for her gender critical views. And the Free Speech Union helped her, and she put me straight in contact with Ben Jones, who's the case director, and they helped me draft emails back to Leeds Student Radio asking them to specify what they were accusing me of. They couldn't specify. They just said that I had put the health and safety of other members at risk. They said that I had acted in a selfish way and that I hadn't acted in a way that basically is in line with the code of conduct, but it was all very vague. And the fact I was being accused of putting the health and safety of other members at risk was just incredible. But from that point onwards, I was not allowed to step foot in the LSR office where I had spent hours basically every day since the start of term. So I'd spend hours sitting in there editing my podcast. I'd be socializing with people, but I had been suspended, wasn't allowed to go to the office. I wasn't allowed to speak to anyone about it because they told me it has to be kept confidential. And again, all of my friends had left. I was living with one of my friends from school and his friends in his year group at uni because he'd done a gap year. And so I didn't have close people who were close to me that I could speak to about it. I was at this point a member of the Women's Rights Network. So I had them, which was amazing. And I'd met lots of young people through free speech events. So I had people in the background, but no one at uni, other than my one friend who was very kind and frankly brave, who came with me to the meeting as part of the investigation because I could bring a friend with me, but they said it had to be from someone within the society, which is insane considering it was the society that decided to suspend me, or supposedly people at the society who complained about me. I was never told who the complainant was. And so we went to the investigation meeting, the interview, and They had hard copies of my screenshots of my Twitter account. They had hard copies of my article that I'd written for Graham. And it was so bizarre. And one of their questions was, despite the fact I'd reminded them many times that it's an unlawful act of discrimination to suspend me on the basis of my gender critical views or my expression of them. And they kept saying, this isn't about your gender critical views, but how do you maintain an inclusive environment at LSR, considering your choice to post your views online makes some people feel unincluded? It was just extraordinary what they were asking me. And I left that meeting. I had no contacts from anyone at LSR other than one person eventually, which was really nice at the time.
That response from the university, but from all directions, is so extreme and so immediate. I mean, you spoke to Jane a little bit about growing up and woke culture when you were in school and this idea that there's a wrong way to think or a right way to think. When that turns on you, that must have been overwhelming, especially when you're in your last year and have bigger fish to fry, really. You're thinking towards your future at that stage.
Yeah, well, that was the thing you said about how it was so immediate. That was one of the things that there was no point at which they said, Connie, can we have a conversation with you about what you're
That's
talking
what I wanted
about?
to ask.
It went straight to, you've been suspended. You're not allowed to step foot in the office. You have to take yourself off all of the group chats. On what they said, it needs to be confidential, but you also have to remove yourself from everything. It's like, well, how am I meant to remove myself from everything without explaining to people what I'm doing?
Yeah.
And I know that the day I was suspended, there was a committee meeting which I was meant to be going to, but then I got the email saying I was suspended, so I didn't go anymore. I didn't go in the end. And I know that at that meeting, the words were, let's address the elephant in the room. Connie's not here, even though it was meant to be confidential. So everyone knew about it straight away. Everyone knew that I was suspended, and I had no one to speak to about it.
I think as well,
Just
universities have to understand the importance of support networks and that a lot of students are far from home, that they've maybe only had short-term friendships with most of the people they're surrounded by. It sounds like they made you a social pariah in your final year.
That's what's so funny, is that they would be like, oh, of course, all the well-being support is on offer. Get in contact with this person. It's like, you're the ones who don't like me and you're all signing your emails off with your pronouns. It's like an atheist being tried for blasphemy, and all of the people who are signing their emails off to them, who's saying, I'll come if you want some help, have some sort of religious dogma in their email signatures. It's just so ridiculous. But they came to the conclusion that I was perfectly able to carry out my committee position. There was no reason why they thought in the end that my views meant that I couldn't support trans students. And I had to explain to them that just because I believe that biological sex is real does not mean I go around abusing people and treating people differently because they don't think it's real, whether they identify in a different way. So they ended up saying that, there's no reason why you can't do your committee position. That allegation was dropped about putting the health and safety of people at risk, because I think they ended up realising that actually we can't be seen to directly discriminate against her on the basis of her gender critical views. But the reason for permanently removing me from my committee position and telling me that if I wanted to run again, I would have to write a letter of apology to the wider membership. Thinking about it now, I just think it just makes me so angry, because they knew that I would never do that, because that's humiliating in itself. It's like, if you want to dare to run again, you have to embarrass yourself again to show how really sorry you are.
And also admit fault.
Yeah, I know. Write a letter of apology and take a training course in online conduct. But they claimed the reason for suspending me was because I'd brought LSR into disrepute because I included the bit in my article about the post with my name and pronouns on. And because I'd publicly criticised LSR and my name could be traced back to my committee position, that was enough to permanently remove me, which is a bit crazy, because you're saying, so you're going to sack anyone who says anything bad about LSR, are you? That doesn't sound very democratic.
But also it's sort of an admission of guilt on their part, isn't it? If they feel that brings them into disrepute, then they must accept that they did something wrong there.
I know. Are they not proud of their pronouns without even asking people? But the radio stuff is just by the by at this point, because The week after I was suspended from my committee position, I was called in for an informal meeting with my head of department in the philosophy school. I went in, I took the same friend with me. Thank God I had a witness to that conversation. And he was annoyed or had an issue with the article that I wrote for Graham. And because in that article, I also wrote about how my feminist philosophy module, not only was there not a single gender critical paper on the reading list, but also the essay questions were pushing us in one direction. But the person teaching us these topics about trans ideology was a man who identifies as a woman. And I said, with all these three things combined, can you imagine being a gender critical student wanting to write your essay from a gender critical perspective? And I said, imagine as a student how that feels. My head of department said to me that I was questioning my lecturer's professionalism by suggesting that the guy couldn't mark the essays properly. And he said, you could be disciplined. He said, I'm not going to discipline you, but if you're not careful, you could be disciplined for this sort of thing. Other things he said to me was, I've been friends with Kathleen Stott for 25 years. If she can be respectful, why can't you? And I could only assume that was to do with my choice to use male pronouns for a man, whereas Kathleen, I think at the time of writing her book, sometimes would use she, her pronouns for men. But now I think is far more hard line on it. I think she has changed her opinion slightly, which is funny because clearly he's not that great friends with Kathleen. If he doesn't understand that she may have changed,
clearly not keeping up with Kathleen.
Yeah. Yeah. So I didn't really know what he meant at the time. It was only afterwards when I thought about it, because it was such a strange sort of, not threatening thing to say, but kind of like, I'm mates with one of your heroes, so don't try and pretend that I'm not on your side, sort of thing, trying to suggest that he was really on my side and that he really understood. But even so, even if I disagree, who says that because I'm a TERF means I have to agree with everything that Kathleen Stock says, or anything that any other TERF says for that matter? I said to him, there's no gender critical papers on the reading list. And he said, well, if students want more things to read, then they can always ask. And I said, what? So it's on the onus of the student to ask for the other side of the debate of this really hotly debated topic that there is nothing provided for. And he's like, you're underestimating your fellow peers. And he said, I know, you think that everyone's been brainwashed. And I was like, well, yeah, I do. But also, how dare you say that to me?
Yeah.
I've not said anything of the sort. He was assuming my opinions. And it's like, well, if they're not being given anything else to read, then what can you call that? If they're being fed this propaganda. He also said, there's never been any issue with this module before. And I said, just because no one said anything doesn't mean that hasn't been an issue. And he said, that's what a paranoid person would say. So the whole thing was just this insane gaslighting.
Yeah.
And so I'm so glad that I took my friend with me to have a witness, because otherwise he could just deny all of those things that he said to me. I mean, the Kathleen Stock comment was just insane. Anyway, so that meeting happened and I agreed, because I was like, shit, I don't want to risk my degree here. I'm going to keep my mouth shut. So I did nothing else of the sort. Then, after I started doing media about student radio, and it was the day I was in Portcollins House, that day I had been on Julie Hartley-Brewer on Talk TV about the student radio stuff. I was sat next to Jane in Portcollins House with Emma and Rosie, and I got an email from the same head of department saying, having looked back at the material we discussed, I've decided there is a case to answer, even though he told me I wouldn't be being disciplined. So it was all very coincidental, the fact that I was doing all the media, and then suddenly he's like, actually, I am going to discipline you. So then I got an email from the case team, and it was this massive list of allegations. There were 5 main allegations. 1, because I'd used the term trans-identified male. He claimed that that was a slur. 2 was repeated misgendering, which I referred to the lecturer in the interview with Graham. I didn't name him. I just said, the guy teaching me feminist philosophy identifies as a woman. I think people should be able to talk about these things. The most insane allegation was that I had not distanced myself from Graham's remarks. And they said, because I said to Graham in my interview with him that it was an honour to interview him, that therefore I wasn't distancing myself from his remarks, and that he was such a controversial figure. The fact that I had said it was an honour to interview him was enough for me to be guilty of harassing this other member of staff. I was accused of harassing this member of staff. And the other allegation was that I had outed this member of staff, despite the fact he goes on about being trans all the time. What was really funny is that he has a website. Well, it spoke about queerness and his queer exhibitions, and he's in a queer choir. During my disciplinary, he removed all of that. One of the allegations being that I had outed him. So luckily we had archives of all of this stuff because the FSU is very good at gathering evidence to prove that I hadn't outed this guy who's very open about the fact he's trans, and I have eyes, and every student has eyes. This is why this whole ideology is so ridiculous, because it's like you will be in trouble if you don't lie about what this man is. Anyway, I was eventually taken to a preliminary hearing where I had to comment on each of the allegations. And one of my comments was, I think that the university's policy is discriminating against me on the basis of my gender critical views. And I explained that. And then they got back to me and they replied saying, having assessed what we spoke about, in writing, the university said, because you said you thought you're being discriminated against, we're going to raise this to a committee hearing so that you can discuss these ideas further. Once a case gets raised to a committee hearing, the alleged offences become automatically classed as major or serious. If you're found guilty of a major or serious offence, you can either be suspended from uni and fined up to 500 quid or just expelled. So because I said I was discriminated against, they then made it even worse for me, which is unlawful victimization.
It sounds, and it is, a vendetta. In that moment, you're obviously somebody who has worked very hard. You're in the final year of your degree, and actually you're in the final months of your degree, right?
Yeah,
so,
I was writing my dissertation at this point.
So the stakes couldn't be higher.
Yeah.
What you stand to lose. I mean, how could they hang something like that over your head?
I know.
How did it resolve?
So got the letter back after the preliminary hearing saying it was being raised. Toby Young, obviously General Secretary of the Free Speech Union, wrote a letter to the Vice Chancellor of the university telling her to call it off, saying that this is just ridiculous and unlawful, what's going on. And the Vice Chancellor replied saying that she couldn't do anything about it and the hearing has to be confidential and it's up to them. I got the letter of the allegations early December, and then the hearing wasn't until early February. So for 2 months, 2.5 months, December and January, over this exam period over Christmas, I was thinking, what's the point of me doing these exams when I might be expelled? I had to wait for the hearing. It was the start of February. I had a 16-page long legal defense written up for me by the Free Speech Union and with the help of Justin Rushbrook, who is a very experienced KC who, had I not been a member of the Free Speech Union, his time and help would have cost me thousands of pounds. But that's what you get when you're a member of the Free Speech Union. If you get into this sort of situation and the FSU can help you, you will be given a barrister basically that comes with your 30 quid membership, which I'd paid. And yeah, 16 pages long, proper legal defense. And I went into the meeting and it lasted about half an hour. And I read out a statement. And they asked me a couple questions and I just stood my ground. And I just knew, and I think they knew as well, that if they tried to punish me, we were going to go absolutely nuclear on this. Imagine if they'd tried to expel me. And the call ended. I was called back 2 hours later and they said, yes, so we found no evidence to find you guilty of any of the alleged offences. However, we would recommend that you look at our inclusivity guidance, just so that next time with the way you express yourself could be a bit more inclusive. 2 months of basically not knowing whether I was going to be expelled during the most stressful time of university to be found not guilty of anything. And then they said, if you speak about this publicly, we could discipline you again. So that's why I've had to wait until I've graduated to talk about this, because if I had spoken about it, I may well have been disciplined again and then maybe expelled, because at that point, I was like, well, who knows if that's going to be classed as major or serious if you can so quickly accelerate things like that. And the major and serious offences that they categorise, that includes physical abuse of someone, damage to property, and my offences were classed in that same category. And the really strange thing about it all is that the member of staff that I was allegedly harassing had nothing to do with the process. He gave no evidence for being harassed. It was all via my head of department. So I have no idea what was going on behind the scenes, whether if this guy was breathing down the neck of the head of the department saying you have to do something and if you don't, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Or if the head of department couldn't believe my cheek. It was just such a strange time. And then having to do the rest of my dissertation, I wrote my dissertation analysing the definitions of women between gender ideology and gender critical feminism, which I ended up getting a first class mark on. funnily enough, my dissertation supervisor changed halfway through the year, which never ever happens. They said it was to do with workload. I'm suspicious of that because my new supervisor, who was excellent, by the way, he was a really good supervisor, but he was the deputy head of my school, i.e. the immediate subordinate to the guy who was disciplining me. So it felt like, I was like, what is this going on? Like trying to watch me or something. I remember in my original supervisor, I think in our second supervision, he'd come with a list of words. He was like, you can't use these words. And one of them was trans-identified male. It's like, that is literally that. My defense on that point was the fact that the term trans-identified male is used in multiple documents that have been submitted to Parliament, to loads of European bodies. That term is used all the time. So to accuse me of using a slur is ridiculous, because that means that all of these other democratic bodies are also employing this slur. Every part of the allegations was just insane. And again, then the fact that they told me that I couldn't talk about it publicly means that the last few months of my university time was really frustrating, because people would still ask me about the radio stuff. It's like, that doesn't matter. That does not matter. And it's like, it was so minor in the end. The radio stuff was so minor. The worst part of it all has been the social consequences. Friends from school have decided to no longer be in contact with me without telling me why they don't want to be in contact with me, which I think is really cowardly. They've never once asked me why it is I think these things.
Yeah.
Being uninvited from stuff, from friends that I've known since I was 11 and have been very close with in the past. Having, just general tensions sometimes at home in Leeds, living at home. But the other thing is that I've also made so many new friends through doing this, and it's so, so nice. I've never actually had so many good friends than I do now. And it's been so liberating, because I feel like I finally found the sort of people that I want to hang out with, because I'm mixing in sort of political and journalist circles that are full of young people as well. And that's the great thing about places like, whether you like what they talk about or the opinions heard on stations like GB News and Talk TV, they give young people opportunities. And I've met so many great people similar to my age who are interested in the same things and don't mind talking about politics the entire night. And you don't get, like you would at uni, someone would say something, ask you a question about this, or have you heard about this, and everyone immediately rolls their eyes and says, oh, not now, let's not get, and so it's been so nice to kind of finally find my crowd. And in the end, I guess it's been worth it, but it is still upsetting, sort of the social cost of knowing that the people who have known you your entire life, basically, you'll never have anymore unless they choose to change their mind, I guess. But yeah, that's basically the story.
It's astounding from the university how they took every opportunity to escalate until it was shut down, only really because they couldn't go anywhere with it. I mean, was there ever any sort of admission that they could have handled things differently, or have they ever approached you in a supportive way and said, sorry, this got out of hand? Or
No, I think that the head of department was probably disappointed that I wasn't disciplined. From subject access requests we did, because it took a while, the whole process, because it was over a couple of months. From subject access requests that we did, he was sending emails asking for updates on the case. So he was keen to hear what had happened. Again, just for legal reasons, I'm sure he'd deny that. But at the same time, if you didn't want me to be disciplined, why did you discipline me when I didn't do anything more? I deliberately made sure to not say anything else about the academic side of things because I didn't want to risk my degree. I didn't think saying that this might be a concern for gender critical students, that would be such a serious offence. I mean, I think to be honest, he hadn't listened to the Graham Linehan podcast. Oh, that was another thing that in the allegations, they claimed that Graham had said about my lecturer that he's a really dishonest and corrupt guy. But actually, they had taken that out of context. The start of Graham's sentence was, I'm sure he's a really nice guy, and to go to the pub with, he'd be really nice. But it's really dishonest and corrupt to do what he's doing, i.e. not only be a man who's pretending to be a woman, but then to teach feminist philosophy. Like, how dare you? I wouldn't really have an issue per se with a man teaching me feminist philosophy, but for a bloke to stand up there and tell me he's a woman, especially the sort of man who clearly has a serious issue with women who don't go along with that, to then teach me feminist philosophy, I think is really offensive. And whether or not it's right or wrong. I don't know, but I think I should be able to say that I think it's wrong. It's not like I advocate for a ban of men who say they're women from teaching philosophy, but it was simply me, myself, I found it offensive. I wasn't going to campaign for him to be kicked off the course, but it's simply my opinion that I would rather not have, in my opinion, a fetishistic bloke teaching me about women's rights.
Why would you feel that way, Connie? Because I'm sitting here disagreeing with you, naturally thinking, can't think of anything more interesting. I'd take popcorn personally. What lies in the future then? Now that university chapter is shut and you've got your first, you're free of it all. What comes next?
Well, I have been working for the Free Speech Union since the beginning of June. So before I graduated, I started full-time work, and that's been an absolute roller coaster. So fun. I'm so lucky to be doing what I love for my first job, to be so incredible. And if I had known a year ago today that I'd be doing the sorts of things that I'm doing now, it's just insane. I don't know what the longer term future holds, but at the moment, I'm very much enjoying my work at the Free Speech Union and helping other people get through similar things. For some people on a far bigger scale, obviously people are getting arrested for social media posts and being prosecuted for tweeting and things like that. But I think what I love so much now is that there is a rapidly growing group of young people who are growing fed up of it, and they are waiting for their time. And very soon you'll be seeing people popping up. And it's an honor to know students who have not only been through worse things than me, and that's what frustrates me, is that if only I wish everyone could hear the stories that I hear from my friends about their times at universities that they're still going through currently. But not only have they gone through worse things, but no one hears about them, because my circumstances were so perfect that I wanted to go into broadcast journalism, hence my involvement in student radio. And I had nothing to lose. I was like, I don't have any mates anyway now. No one came into my year because they all left for year awards and placements. I have my housemates who, they were great and they were good friends, but they didn't really seem to care. Like, we didn't really speak about it much at all. But I didn't have friends at least student radio. My netball friends more or less stood by me, never really got involved. They never stopped talking to me because of it. Even though I wasn't playing netball at the time, I was very isolated, so I didn't have anything to lose really. Whereas these are students who are still got 2 or 3 years left at uni, who are being cancelled, but they have to really consider what the more sensible option is for them to do. I was in my final year. I knew that I was going to be going off at the end. And I could really use it as a springboard into a career. Whereas there are so many students out there who simply don't have that opportunity. Like, they don't want to go into broadcast journalism or anything public facing, and they don't want to ruin their career prospects in different industries, which are still so overrun with being captured of gender ideology. So that's what I'm hoping the future holds, is regardless of what I end up doing, you'll be seeing more and more young people coming out and putting their heads above the parapet.
Perfect. Well, I think that your university did everything they could to make an example of you, and you have risen above it and built a career and built skills in terms of resilience and in terms of handling a crisis, I'm sure you'll use for the rest of your life.
So we come to our final question. For people who've been listening to you today and found this really interesting, is there a woman of the moment that you would like to recommend they look at and seek out in order to find out more?
So I would recommend Susan Smith, who is one of the directors of For Women Scotland, and she's done various media stuff. You can watch interviews that she's done on YouTube, and obviously she's written a chapter in Women Won't Weesht. And she was integral to me peaking. Everyone should listen to that episode on BBC Radio 4. I can't remember the exact name, but it's the antisocial podcast, and it will be on trans. I'm sure if you search her name, it will come up. And that was the episode that piqued me. Oh, and I would also recommend listen to the episode on Spotify with that interview with the trans students. It's still on there, and it's Ipswich School. And just find it on their Spotify, and it's a Pride Month special with my name on it and also the student's name. But the other person I'd like to shout out is my friend Lottie. She's a school friend and has really been my sort of intellectual partner, to be honest, my whole schooling life, like throughout sixth form and going to uni, even though we don't see each other that much. I was reading through our old chats earlier just to sort of remind myself when it was at certain points that I realised certain things, and just going through my chats with her, it's like, that is a documentary in itself of the way that my views have changed and hers as well. So yeah, just I would say Lottie as well. And you can see her, she's on Twitter and had similar experiences with free speech at uni. And she had a feature in the Telegraph. And well, I think they refer to her as her full name, Charlotte Tredget. She's in the Telegraph. Yeah. And she's someone that I feel like in academia, she's someone to keep track of, because yeah, she's probably the most intelligent person I've ever met. And has really reassured me throughout this period that I'm not going crazy, and that someone that I look up to intellectually also thinks these things. Yeah, so they're the two ladies that I'd shout out.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for talking to us. It's been really fascinating,
It's
actually.
been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you to our listeners. We really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, please do like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff to help keep our channel growing and spread the word. Thank you.